So this is the last part of our discussion about dreaming and seeing, which is reflecting all the 10 steps that the author Haut talked about in Think Like an Architect. And so hopefully this helps you kind of crystallize your ideas about what you might start to look at when you go to do the building visiting assignment, where you're going to go to a building and analyze the building using these 10 steps. So the last couple that we're going to look at, number 9, is one that talks about the appropriateness of the building, within its context. So it says, observe the appropriateness of the building. Now, when we talk about observing, we're just taking in the information. Again, we're trying not to make too many judgments like, I don't like that, or, this is, what I think in terms of its aesthetics, so much as observing not just the building and the architecture, but what's around it. So you're trying to assess, is it in the natural landscape? Are we looking at how it's responding to its surroundings naturally, or maybe it's an urban setting, and we're trying to assess whether it's appropriate for either the size or scale or use of the buildings around it. Now that doesn't mean it has to be exactly the same as what's around it, but we're just talking about what's appropriate. Now obviously appropriate is a subjective term and not necessarily objective, but we're trying to be as objective as possible and as observational, I suppose, as possible. So let's take a look at some examples of that. Now this is a residence, and we're looking at this in terms of, what's around it. Now we don't really know what's around it, but this is in a temperate climate, kind of given limited information, that this is responding to what you're able to do in that climate. So obviously it's not like a snowy or cold climate, so having something open is appropriate given that it will be comfortable weather-wise in this particular climate. Again, even if we're not given that information, we can kind of make some assumptions about that. But the first example that we're going to look at is Sea Ranch. And Sea Ranch is a notable kind of architectural work in the mid-1960s, and it was built by a firm called MLTW, and each of the letters MLTW is the first letter of the last name of the people in the firm. And many of them, or most of them, went on to significant work on their own and with each other, kind of in collaboration with each other. But the reason why we look at Sea Ranch is because at the time, leading up to this, kind of in the post-World War II era, like 1940s, 50s, and 60s, there was a real focus on machine age aesthetic, kind of the standardization of materials, and almost showing off, almost like a new industrial age, like what could be done with steel and glass, and making things kind of taller, bigger, faster, better, and looking at things that were not necessarily customized, but maybe were more ordered and industrial in their appearance and also their construction. And so Sea Ranch really takes the opposite approach at that time and looks at the individual site where the building is going to be placed, instead of saying, okay, well, I'm going to make a bunch of a certain kind of building and I can kind of build it almost like a factory assembly line and just kind of plop it down no matter where it's sited. This looks extremely specifically at the site where it's located, takes into account the climate, the slope of the terrain, the experience of the person in that particular building, and the views that they're seeing out, the views into the structure and the site. And we can see in this photograph that the slope of the roof really follows the slope of the landscape as it goes down to the ocean. So this is in California, and this complex is overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Now, most of what we talk about with Sea Ranch in this complex finished around 1965 is Condominium 1. So Condominium 1 is a 10-unit complex that was the first portion of a greater planned complex at Sea Ranch. And so the overall complex of Sea Ranch continues to be built after 1965, but this is the one that people kind of refer to as the buildings of note. And as we look at this, we see that there are some more intimate spaces formed with Sea Ranch. And one of the things that the architects did was use natural materials. These are covered in redwood siding, and look at, using materials that more reflect the site that it happens to be on. And also looking at what is the experience of a human kind of interacting with this space, instead of just kind of making a box and saying, okay, well, we're just going to shove the functions of this building into this box. It's saying, okay, well, how does a person move through this building? And there are all these kind of small spaces for reflection and contemplation and individual functions that happen within each of these units. As we look at not only the experience inside of the building, you can also see that the spacing out of the individual buildings and units, this is a complex of buildings, it frames views out to the ocean. So instead of just having one big thing where everything inside looks out, moving throughout the buildings and in between the buildings, you're capturing views and vistas that go off into the distance, sometimes catching glimpses of the ocean, sometimes catching glimpses of the natural landscape or the topography beyond. But it really looks at the landscape to influence the forms of the building and the experience of the user or the person occupying the site. Now, another thing that we look at too is the rise in this idea of the natural landscape influencing not only the architecture, but collaborating or being designed in conjunction with the landscape architecture. So the landscape architect Lawrence Halpern, he was a collaborator on this project, and his work with the architects really, created this whole complex and this idea that it was going to be more about simplicity, and there's not a lot of extra stuff on these buildings. There are no overhangs, there's not a lot of trim. It's just kind of using this wood siding and then creating openings where they're going to be most beneficial, looking out to create views and also to get light into the structure, either from above or through skylights or through separate openings. There's some planted roofs, and really utilizing the slope of the site to influence what that was going to be. The other thing that they did was look to local kind of farm and barn structures and buildings. At the time, I don't think that looking at more kind of humble structures was as popular, because a lot of times architects would look to more grand scale structures for inspiration or for historical precedent, but they were looking to kind of simple structures that were local and would influence the forms and materials that they used. So MLTW is the name of the firm, but it's Charles Moore, Donlin Linden, William Turnbull, and Richard Whitaker are the main principals who worked on this. Another more contemporary example that we look at is The Mountain House by Rick Joy, and this is in Tucson, Arizona. And even though this is a much different landscape and climate than at Sea Ranch, it really takes those same principles that were established at Sea Ranch and looks to the landscape, the climate, the natural siting, the vegetation, all as influence in the architecture. And, much of what Rick Joy does is utilize materials that are responsive to the local climate and are locally available. In this photograph, you see the walls. They kind of look like pink walls with like little wavy lines on them. And these are rammed earth walls. And rammed earth is a type of construction that's not unlike concrete, but uses mostly dirt. So you take dirt, you mix a little bit of Portland cement and some water, but you just mix that together and then keep tamping it down and making these layers of wall until it's kind of formed up and cured, and then you keep, kind of layering that up. So it's a little bit like concrete, but mostly dirt. And so what that does is in the desert landscape, it is able to act as a heat sink. The walls are quite thick, and so the temperature is really hot in the daytime, so those heat up. But in this particular part of the desert, it cools off a lot at night, and so those walls can release heat throughout the evening and nighttime when the temperature drops quite a bit. So that difference between day and night temperature, we refer to that as diurnal flux, and so that kind of climactic character of the diurnal flux really influences the materials and the form and the construction of this house. Now, one of the other things that it does is, and you see this rammed earth wall kind of on the left side of this photograph and off to the front, but it acts almost like as a protective enclosure here. So there's a bunch of glass, which typically would not be, super beneficial in, this type of structure. This is actually in another Rick Joy project. So I haven't included under the Mountain House, but this is just to show an example of some of his work where, it's utilizing this construction technique of rammed earth. And so this kind of back and forth of allowing light and glass in, but protecting it from the direct sunlight and, almost acting as a walled barrier in order to put more glass into the project. Because if you just had a glass box in the desert, it would heat up very quickly and be kind of a harsh internal environment. So as we look at this, this shows, not only the forms of this. The roof is a steel, weathered steel surface that will continue to weather over time. But we see the colors off in the distance of the desert, and all of the materiality of this project, not just the construction technique and the form of the walls, but also the color and the kind of verticality of the cacti and all of the landscape forms kind of coming together to influence this house. The other thing is the siting. When we talk about siting, it's like, how is this turned on the site? Is part of it rotated to the north, to the south, and all of this is sited such that it captures wind patterns and protects on some sides more than others to defend from solar patterns, yet also take in natural light where necessary. Okay, and then the last thing, this is kind of like the catch-all category, and this does become a lot more subjective. Even though, what someone thinks is special might be, different, but when we're talking about analyzing what makes it special, you can start to kind of go down a checklist and say, like, is this different than something else? Is there some other quality that I'm experiencing that, even if you can't quite put your finger on it, that makes it different or makes it unique or special? So we're going to look at a couple examples of this. One is Chapelle Notre du Haut in Ronchamp. Most people just refer to this as Ronchamp or Ronchamp Chapel. This is by Le Corbusier, the architect, and this is a favorite among many architects. And I think the reason why we talk so much about this project and why architects just love the experience of not only visiting this, but just analyzing this is because it is so unique in many aspects. So it's highly customized in that, none of the openings or forms are quite the same as some of the others. I mean, there are some patterns repeated, but as we look at this, especially the experience from the inside, all of these little stained glass pieces and the way the light comes in, these different openings, not only are the sizes of the openings different, but the shapes of them at the exterior and then the 3D forms that these thick walls create. Each piece is a completely different experience. And so, we can look at the uniqueness of it. We can also look at the architect making different choices up to this point, and we can see this is kind of like a late period in the late period of Le Corbusier's career, but early on he was very focused on these standardized, almost machine-driven post-World War construction techniques and designs, and this is a real departure from this, but it's more reflective, maybe even of the art of the time, like Henri Matisse and others who were using stained glass and just these more sculptural forms. And the other thing that happens is, based on the location and the siting of this, it didn't allow for a lot of heavy equipment to go into the site and construct this, so it ended up being kind of a more handmade, customized, sculptural piece of architecture that really, kind of flows with the site, but also is an expression of sculpture rather than a machined product. And the last one that we look at is the Guggenheim Museum at Bilbao. This is by Frank Gehry, and this is an extremely, notable piece of architecture. This was finished in 1997, but because of its notoriety as a cultural icon, it has kind of its own phenomenon attached to it, and we call this the Bilbao effect. So the Bilbao effect says that, most people had not either heard of Bilbao, Spain, or had not traveled to Bilbao, Spain, but because of this one building, this one museum and one piece of architecture, that this city attracts tons of visitors a year. And so, people now talk about the Bilbao effect, like, if we built one thing, could we get a lot of people to come see it, or would it generate enough interest? And this is kind of a turning point in kind of iconic sculptural contemporary architecture, not only for its forms itself, which are certainly unique, but also for its effect on the city and the culture of the area. It's designed around a single kind of sculptural atrium, and so all of the pieces are flanked off of that. And Frank Gehry is, you know, sort of famous for his sculptural forms inside and outside. They're clad in stone, and at the exterior, these titanium panels that really reflect the river that it's sited on and the light outside. And so here we kind of see two different views of the siting of the museum in Bilbao, and so it's in an extremely prominent location, and it takes in lots of visitors every year. And most of the time when you're looking at this, you can see a lot of different forms that Frank Gehry had used prior to this and that he's used since. But I think a lot of critics agreed that his use of form and all these curvilinear forms really kind of came together on this project.